Two deserts can look related while teaching two countries to think in opposite directions. The resemblance is the trap: red stone, hard light, open road, and a completely different national instinct. In Jordan, desert often appears as a threshold, close to roots, borders, cities, and neighbouring worlds. In Algeria, desert becomes distance itself, an interior so large it changes how the country is imagined. The desert is not the background here, it is the first clue. The most familiar visual link between Jordan and Algeria is also the most misleading one. Because desert can act as border, doorway, route, scarcity, interior or scale, depending on the map around it. The point is not that one landscape is harsher or one country more dramatic. The point is function. What job does the desert perform once people build roads, cities, borders and memories around it? So before this becomes a story about culture, history or monuments, watch what the landscape is doing. Wadi Rum gives Jordan one of the world's clearest desert images: sandstone, corridor, horizon and cinematic edge. But an image is not a system. Even a beautiful desert landscape, empty on the surface, can still function as a hinge between places, people and power. Now cross mentally to Algeria, where the Sahara is not simply a faraway backdrop beyond the country. It is part of the country's depth, a southern vastness tied to roads, towns, energy, memory and distance. The Wadi Rum Sahara comparison works visually, then fails geographically, and that failure is where the episode begins. One desert scene points toward the passage ahead, the other turns inward, toward the interior beyond the dunes. That is the reversal. The same broad label hides opposite geographic behaviour. In the cities, the pattern is even harder to ignore, reappearing in street grids, neighbourhood boundaries and on the map. Amman rises inland, folded over hills, with rooftops that often carry the quiet evidence of water pressure. Its urban form feels compressed: stairs, slopes, traffic circles, neighbourhoods, arrivals and the constant nearness of elsewhere. Amman complicates the opposite assumption. It is not a desert fantasy, but a practical city of arrivals and limited water. Algiers faces the Mediterranean differently, with white terraces, a port, hillside layers and old urban memory looking toward the sea. Algiers complicates the desert cliché immediately because its first face is maritime: light, port, hillside, sea air and layered memory. Yet behind that Mediterranean front, the country does not end. It opens inward into mountain ranges, valleys and far more depth than the coast first suggests. One capital looks inward from a crowded Levantine hinge, where old streets and dense neighbourhoods turn attention back toward the country around it. The other faces outward from the coastline, while the national map extends far inland behind it, making the contrast immediately clear. Neither city explains the whole country, but each city reveals what the postcard deserts conceal. Now the map comes in, not as a schoolroom diagram, but as evidence you can actually inspect. Jordan appears compact, positioned among larger neighbours and regional routes, where borders and movements sit close together. Algeria appears on another scale, a Mediterranean north, mountain systems, high plateaus and a Sahara that carries the country southward. The contrast is not just a matter of small versus large, but of how each fills the space around it. It is proximity versus depth. What feels close at the surface reaches much farther below. Jordan's geography keeps pressures close. Water, arrival, diplomacy, roads, and borders often occupy the same mental space. Algeria's geography stretches questions outward. Coast to interior, city to oasis, mountain to desert, infrastructure across distance. This is why the phrase Arab desert nation is useful, but still unfinished, especially when one frame can hold both open desert and a modern city skyline. It names a shared reference, then stops before the most important part, what each place must solve. This matters because labels usually travel faster than landscapes. They make distant places feel familiar before we have understood their mechanics. Seeing sand and stone again, a viewer might assume the same landscape story is repeating, even if the terrain appears unchanged at first glance. But geography is less like a costume you put on than a set of instructions, quietly shaping where people build, move, and stay. It tells cities where to gather, roads where to bend, and states what kinds of pressure cannot be ignored. For Jordan, the desert can feel like an edge where movement gathers and decisions compress. For Algeria, the desert can feel like a world inside the state, demanding connection across scale. That difference will shape how we read roads, capitals, ruins, ports, water, memory and identity later in the film. So the first question is not which country is more desert, more Arab, or more representative. It is simpler and more revealing. In each place, is geography acting like a border, a doorway, an interior, or a system? To understand why the same image performs different work, the camera has to leave the postcard and pull back to the map. If the desert is not doing the same job, what does the map reveal first when you look beyond the empty interior? A country's size does not matter until you ask what that size forces people to manage. After the desert reversal, the map becomes less like background information and more like the first piece of evidence. Jordan is not just small, it is compressed by movement, by borders, by arrival, and by water. Algeria is not just large, it stretches into coast, mountains, plateau, and Saharan depth. The real contrast is not tiny versus huge, it is proximity versus depth. Jordan's map creates constant nearness, while Algeria's map creates vast internal distance. That difference changes how each country feels before culture, history, or politics even enter the frame. As we pull back across the map of the Arab world from North Africa to the Gulf, that single shared label starts to lose its simplicity. Jordan appears as a compact Levantine hinge, placed among roots and larger neighbouring worlds. Algeria appears as a Mediterranean Saharan state, with a north that faces the sea and an interior that keeps unfolding. The point is not to turn scale into a scoreboard, where bigger automatically means better. Scale matters because it creates habits, what must be watched, connected, rationed, crossed, or remembered. This is the chapter's operating system, not a lecture on landmass, but a way to read pressure. In Jordan, international borders sit so close that they shape everyday geography, with neighbouring countries never far from view. Routes, arrivals, diplomacy and water pressure gather inside a tight field of decisions. The country behaves less like a sealed container than a hinge between surrounding worlds. A road in Jordan often feels connected to somewhere else, a border, a capital, a valley, a port. That nearness does not make the place simple. It means the streets, homes, and daily routines sit close together, so every relationship feels immediate. In downtown Amman, the city's hinge becomes visible before any statistic has time to explain it. Its hills collect neighbourhoods, stairways, traffic circles, rooftops, and the evidence of repeated arrival. Rooftop water tanks turn geography into ordinary architecture, a quiet reminder that scarcity is managed at close range. Even a staircase or a narrow hillside street with buildings pressed close on either side can feel like evidence of compression. Movement here is not only traffic, it is family memory, work route, border awareness, and practical adaptation. The city absorbs these pressures across its streets and neighbourhoods without turning them into one simple story. Now cross west into Algeria, where the Sahara takes over and scale stops feeling like measurement. It becomes a climate of distance, a condition that shapes how the country imagines connection. Algeria begins at a Mediterranean edge, but the national story does not stop at the water. The coast leads into the Tel Atlas, high plateaus, oasis towns, and eventually the immense Sahara. The map no longer asks how close everything is, it asks how far a system can travel. Roads, pipelines, administrative reach, regional memory and urban networks all have to negotiate that vastness. An interior of this size changes the emotional meaning of roads and infrastructure. Algiers makes this contradiction physical in a different way, with steep streets and sharp divides between the waterfront and the hills above. The city faces the Mediterranean with terraces, port shapes, boulevards and pale hillside walls. But behind that sea-facing posture, the country pulls inward and southward, away from the postcard image. Algeria's interior is not a blank beyond the capital, it is part of what the state must organise. The capital can look Mediterranean while the national map keeps pointing beyond the mountains. This is why simple area comparisons like matching shapes on a flat map can be so misleading. Small and large are facts, but proximity and depth are the systems that people actually experience. In Jordan, a route can quickly become a border question, an urban question, or a water question. In Algeria, a coastal road can become a mountain road, then a plateau road, then a desert road. The sequence teaches a different patience. Distance is not only crossed, it has to be maintained. Watch the human clues instead of the regional label. Faces, clothing, and the way people move through the street. A rooftop tank, a hillside staircase, a ring road, a distant port, a highway bending from coast toward interior. These are not decorative details, they show what each map asks people to solve, day after day. The label Arab World Map explains a family of references, but not the local mechanics. Jordan's hinge logic rewards balance, quick adaptation and awareness of pressure arriving from several directions. Algeria's interior logic rewards endurance, infrastructure and memory stretched across coast, mountain, plateau and desert. Neither logic is better and neither is more representative of the Arab world. They reveal how Levant and Maghreb can share references while solving different geographic problems. Once the map has changed the meaning of scale, the desert itself has to be reread, not as empty space but as a landscape of distance, routes and scattered landmarks. What happens when the desert is not empty scenery, but a different kind of national machinery? The same word, desert, can mean a dramatic edge in one country and a national interior in another. Wadi Rum is not the Sahara, even if wide shots of its red sand and sandstone cliffs can make it look that way. Their colours may rhyme, but their jobs inside Jordan and Algeria are almost opposite. Jordan's desert imagery often points toward roots, thresholds and border imagination. Algeria's Sahara has to be read as settlement, distance, infrastructure, identity and scale. That is the reversal. Not which desert is more beautiful, but what each desert makes a country solve. In Wadi Rum, the landscape rises like a gate. Cliffs, corridors and red sandstone holding the eye close. It feels vast on camera, but on Jordan's map it often sits at the edge, out near the country's border rather than at its centre. Roads can move you from desert quiet toward Aqaba, Amman, or neighbouring borderlands with surprising speed. So the Jordan Desert becomes a threshold, a place where movement is always implied. Even its cinematic power comes from arriving, crossing, entering, or leaving. The emptiness is never simply empty because the map around it is crowded with direction. There is always a city, a port, a border, or a remembered route just beyond the frame. Wadi Rum gives Jordan its desert image, with red sand and sandstone cliffs, but that image also points back toward passage through this landscape. Now cut to Algeria, and the same visual language suddenly becomes misleading. The Algerian Sahara is not a backdrop at the edge of the national story. It is not simply what begins after the country ends. It stretches inside the country's scale, changing how distance, roads, settlements and state infrastructure have to be imagined. Here, the desert is not just something beyond the city, it is one of the country's great interiors. A road in Jordan can feel like a route between pressures. A road in the Algerian Sahara can feel like a line holding continental distance together. That difference matters because distance is not only physical, it changes supply, memory, work, architecture, and the mental size of the nation. The Sahara asks Algeria to think in long lines, long maintenance and long historical echoes across a desert that must be crossed again and again. Look for the evidence at the edges of settlement, not only in dunes. A fuel stop, a shaded wall, a water container, a road marker without readable names. These are desert systems made visible. They show how the landscape becomes routine rather than spectacle. The point is not to turn desert life into an outsider's fantasy. It is to notice adaptation, how people build pauses, routes, shelter, trade and memory into harsh space. In Jordan, that adaptation often shows up right at the edges, where one landscape gives way to another. In Algeria, it often appears inside a scale so deep that the horizon becomes administrative, cultural and emotional. This is why the Algerian Sahara cannot be reduced to sand. Gardaya in the Mzab Valley shows oasis urban geometry shaped by community, climate and careful density. Farther south, Tamanrasset and the Hoggar landscape suggest another Algeria, one carried by mountains, roads and Saharan belonging, far from the Mediterranean image many outsiders keep in mind. These places widen the frame beyond Algiers, beyond the coast and beyond the easy postcard. They also remind us that desert identity is not one thing and not always visible from a capital. The more Algeria's desert becomes a world, the less useful a simple Wadi Rum Sahara comparison becomes. Return now to Jordan's desert and the contrast sharpens rather than disappears. Wadi Rum carries Bedouin memory, tourism imagination, filmic grandeur and the nearness of routes through southern Jordan. But it does not need to contain the whole national scale in the same way. Its power is gateway power, drama, movement and edge compressed together. Algeria's Sahara resists that grasp because its meaning grows with distance. It contains oasis towns, desert roads, mountain regions and cultural layers. The same desert vocabulary has split into two functions. One invites the eye toward crossing, the other forces the mind to deal with depth. And that is the larger lesson of this chapter. Geography is not just scenery behind a nation, it is a set of tasks repeated into instinct. In Jordan, the desert often helps explain ideas of passage, balance and nearness across a wide open landscape. For Algeria, it helps explain distance, interior continuity, and the difficulty of holding scale together. But deserts are not the only landscapes people misread as symbols, especially from a distance or in a single photograph. What if the famous stone worlds of Petra and the Kasbah are not just heritage but spatial clues? Some famous places are misunderstood because people look at them as destinations before asking how they control movement. Petra is not only a wonder carved into rock, and the Kasbah is not only an old quarter. Petra's corridor logic and the Kasbah's layered urban memory both show that passage can become identity, but toward different national instincts. After Wadi Rum and the Sahara, the question moves from open landscape into built space. At Petra, the first lesson is not the monument, it is the approach, the narrowing, the feeling of being guided before the city appears. The rock does not simply frame a view, it controls arrival, pace, exposure and attention. This is why Petra Jordan matters inside this comparison. It reveals a country where roots and thresholds keep returning as a pattern. The famous facade is not the whole argument. Inside, the corridor does some of the thinking too, guiding you step by step before the building fully reveals itself. It compresses movement, then releases it into a world of trade, shelter, ceremony and power. Jordan's wider map keeps echoing that feeling. Short distances, close pressures, routes that quickly become borders. A narrow place becomes more than a passage. It becomes a way of understanding the hinge. Now shift from sandstone to a different kind of density. The Kasbah of Algiers, a tight maze of whitewashed lanes stacked above the sea. The Kasbah of Algiers is not a single monument waiting at the end of a path. It is a historic urban fabric where layers keep living. Its lanes climb, bend, hide, reveal and fold daily life into architecture, sea and memory. Here passage is not a desert corridor toward a carved city, it is a city of corridors. Here, the movement is tighter, more vertical and more inhabited, with people flowing through narrower spaces. Stairs, doors, white walls, shadow turns and courtyards hold memory before any official history explains it. Algiers faces the Mediterranean, but the country behind it reaches deep toward mountains, plateau, oasis and desert interior. That makes its old quarter feel less like an entrance than a compressed archive, with centuries packed into a few narrow streets and stone facades. In Jordan, stone passage often points outward, toward route, border, caravan memory and the logic of crossing. In Algeria, urban passage often folds inward, toward layered rule, resistance, neighbourhood memory and the pressure of a sea-facing capital. A map can show the difference in borders and distance, but architecture lets you feel it the moment you step into the street. Route lines around Petra reveal how a narrow landscape could organise movement across a compressed hinge. The urban grain of Algiers reveals something else, a coastal city carrying centuries inside a layered map of streets. The useful comparison is not beauty against beauty, or heritage against heritage. It is function against function. It is how built places teach people to read pressure, where to enter, where to pause, where to remember. In Petra, control is built into the approach, a narrow path, a wall of stone on either side, and the city held back until the reveal. In the Casbah, memory is visible in repetition. Stair after stair, corner after corner lives stacked inside history. Doors, arches, thresholds, steps, carved surfaces, and worn walls become evidence. They make geography tactile. These details matter because national instincts are rarely invented in speeches. They are practiced in spaces. A compressed country often learns the politics of proximity, passage, balance, contact, and survival between neighbouring worlds. A vast country with a sea-facing capital often learns the politics of depth, memory, distance, interior, and what has passed through. So passage becomes identity in both places, but not in the same direction. One points through a corridor, the other accumulates in a city. Once passage and memory are visible in stone, the next question is what history did to those instincts. Why did the afterlife of empire feel so different in these two countries, even in the streets and symbols people saw every day? History matters here only when it still shapes how the place responds to pressure in its streets, buildings, and daily routines. After Petra's corridor and Casbah lanes, the question is not what happened first, but what kept echoing. This is not a date sequence. It is a present-day reflex test, the kind a doctor might do in a clinic with a quick tap below the knee. Jordan's Mandate-era afterlife and Algeria's French settler colonial rupture left different spatial memories. You can still sense them in borders, boulevards, offices, and the way each country reads outside pressure. By this point, even a simple side-by-side comparison on screen has already stopped working. Jordan is not simply the smaller country on the map, and Algeria is not just the larger one stretching across North Africa. Geography showed a hinge and an interior, but terrain alone cannot explain national instinct. Countries inherit roots, institutions, memory, language, and the habits of survival built around them. This is the midpoint turn, from what the map makes possible to what history makes difficult to forget. In Jordan, modern statehood formed in a landscape of neighbouring powers and close borders. The Emirate of Transjordan emerged under British Mandate-era arrangements after the First World War. That history did not make Jordan only an outside design local rule. Tribal relationships, cities and regional currents mattered. But it did leave people in this state reading proximity with unusual care, judging every step and every gap a little more closely. The map made pressure ordinary: Palestine to the west, Syria to the north, Iraq and Arabia close by. In Jordan modern history, survival often meant balance, mediation and adaptation inside a crowded regional room. The concern is not abstract, it sits in how maps, ministries, roads and families imagine the near outside. That is why the border versus interior loop returns here. Jordan's afterlife is not only political, it is spatial. It shows up in road corridors, administrative neighbourhoods, security-minded edges, and a capital built by repeated arrivals. Amman does not carry memory like a museum display, it carries it as expansion, adjustment, and practical absorption. The city climbs its hills, with streets and buildings stacked in layers as each decade made room for the next. Algeria inherited a different wound and a different scale of memory, shaped by a long and brutal war of independence. French rule in Algeria was not simply distant administration, it became settler colonialism, land rupture, urban redesign and hierarchy. Algiers' colonial history is visible in the contrast between sea-facing boulevards and older dense quarters nearby. The capital can look Mediterranean at first glance, almost open toward Europe. But the national imagination also turns inland toward mountains, plateaus, oases, and the Sahara as depth. Quick pause. If you want the maps and sources behind this episode, check the pinned comment and tell us which contrast is landing for you. Then return to Algiers, where white hillsides drop toward the harbour and the city still refuses a single reading. Its streets hold Ottoman traces, French urban layers, independence memory, and the daily movement of a present tense city. Algeria's liberation war did not become just an event in the past, it became a reference point for sovereignty and memory. For many Algerians, independence is connected to language, land, dignity, and the refusal to be treated as an extension of elsewhere. So outside pressure is often read through a different emotional register than in Jordan, where the same public tension can land with a different social weight. Not because one memory runs deeper, but because the historical machinery behind it, archives, schools, and public rituals, worked differently. Jordan's challenge was often to maneuver among nearby forces without losing room to act. Algeria's challenge was to reclaim a vast country from a colonial system that had tried to redefine belonging itself. One afterlife trains attention toward border pressure, the other trains attention toward rupture, sovereignty, and national depth. Now bring the camera back down to human scale, where the street-level details start to come into focus. A government building, a shaded stair, a boulevard, a hillside road. None explains a country alone. But together in the street layout and daily routines, these details show how history becomes an operating habit. In Amman, arrivals and proximity keep producing a politics of accommodation and caution. In Algiers, sea-facing openness sits beside a memory of intrusion, resistance, and a hinterland too large to ignore. The comparison is not about blame or about which history matters more, but about how these stories sit side by side in the same place. It is about how past systems keep shaping what feels natural, risky, or non-negotiable. This is where the shared label begins to strain, as places grouped together start to show clear differences in identity and character. Arab is real here, but it does not erase Levantine, Maghrebi, Amazigh, Bedouin, Mediterranean, Muslim, Christian, Oasis, or mountain worlds. But history cannot explain everything if the identity labels themselves, on maps or in official records, are too smooth. In these countries, who does the word Arab actually include, and which identities does that broad label hide beneath it? A label can be true and still be too small. The word Arab is part of the story, not the container for the whole story, because place keeps adding older and closer layers than expected. In Jordan, identity is shaped by Levantine proximity, route memory, Bedouin worlds, city arrivals, and Muslim and Christian histories living close together inside tight geography. In Algeria, the layers widen. Arab, Amazigh, Maghrebi, Mediterranean, mountain, Oasis, and Saharan worlds, sharing one national frame at once. So this chapter is not a glossary. It is a walk through landscapes that refuse one simple word. Start in Amman, where the city does not feel built from one arrival, but from many, again and again. Hill-stacked neighbourhoods above roads, stairways, markets, apartments and rooftops that quietly record pressure, belonging and ordinary daily patterns. Some identities here are local and old others are carried by families who arrived later, often through pressure. That does not make the city temporary. It makes the city skilled at absorbing layered presence into life. Jordan's compression turns culture into proximity, village memory, urban life, border awareness, and desert routes within reach, sometimes quickly. The Bedouin-linked landscapes are not costumes for the camera, they are route knowledge, hospitality, memory, and adaptation across dry space. But Jordan is also Levantine in ways a desert label can hide. Food rhythms, dialect traces, worship spaces, and neighbouring histories nearby. Mosques and churches, old stone and new concrete, do not explain everything, but they complicate the shorthand on one walk. Now cross the map westward, and Algeria refuses simplification by changing scale before it changes language beneath you. Algiers faces the Mediterranean, but the country behind it does not end at the waterfront, the boulevard, or terraces. The sea-facing capital carries Maghrebi habits, Ottoman echoes, French colonial scars, revolutionary memory, and everyday North African confidence at once. Then the mountains interrupt any easy image. Kabylie makes Algeria visible as a mountain country, not only a desert one with layered villages. Amazigh identity here is not a footnote to Arab identity, it is one of the deep languages of place and memory. The point is not to separate people into boxes, it is to notice how landscapes preserve difference without turning people into categories. A village on a slope teaches identity differently than a port, a capital, or a Saharan road held in stone. This is why Kabylie Algeria matters visually. It breaks the flat image before argument even begins on screen. Farther south, Gardaia changes the lesson again because oasis urbanism is neither postcard desert nor coastal city near the Mzab. Its compact architecture, courtyards, alleys, and settlement geometry suggest a society organised around climate, community, trade, and restraint over generations. Gardaia Algeria shows the desert as urban intelligence, not emptiness waiting to be crossed, with its own grammar. That matters because Algeria's interior is not a backdrop. It is part of the national imagination, not outside. Jordan has desert memory too, but the scale changes the feeling of that memory inside a smaller map. In Jordan, desert routes press close to cities, borders, tourism images, family histories, and state balance within reach. In Algeria, desert depth can feel like a second horizon inside the country, stretching identity across distance and climate. The shared Arab frame remains real, especially through language, religion, media, and regional belonging across both societies. But reality does not become smaller because a label is useful. A useful label can still be unfinished from far away. Look at the details: bread cooling in a market, tiled courtyards, hillside apartments, desert fabric, coastal balconies in afternoon light. None of these details should be treated as souvenirs. They are evidence of systems people live inside, not decoration. Jordan culture often reveals compression, many memories close enough to meet on the same street or rooftop. Algerian culture often reveals range, coast, mountain, oasis, capital, and Sahara, all pulling on the same national conversation. That is why the comparison works only when it stops trying to crown one identity. The question is not which country represents the Arab world. It is why the Arab world contains both patterns. Identity becomes clearer when movement is visible. Who arrives, who leaves, who returns, and what the coast allows. So now, follow the routes outward. What do ports, routes, and migration memory reveal that deserts alone cannot. A desert comparison becomes stranger when the most revealing clue is the sea. Jordan meets the sea like an outlet, Algeria meets it like a whole northern world. Ports reveal national psychology because they show whether access feels like release, inheritance, migration memory, or a route into the interior. In Aqaba, Jordan, the sea appears as a narrow opening at the country's southwestern edge, beside mountains and port water. It is not the whole national face, it is a hinge where land finally exhales into trade, ferries and road corridors. The Red Sea here matters precisely because access is concentrated, not because the coastline dominates the map among desert, border and sea. In Algeria, the northern edge behaves differently. Long Mediterranean frontage, coastal cities, mountains behind them, and desert beyond the populated rim. Or in Algeria becomes a useful counterpoint, because it shows the coast as confidence rather than a single escape hatch. The sea is not just scenery, there it is an old direction of trade, departure, return and imagination, carried through families and cities. From Aqaba, the eye turns quickly back inland toward roads, borders, valleys, and the capital's compressed hills where arrivals become neighbourhoods. The coast is important, but it does not dissolve Jordan's hinge logic, it sharpens it. A small outlet can become powerful exactly because the rest of the country feels tightly connected, and alternatives are limited by geography. In Algeria, the coast is not a single punctuation mark, it is a whole sentence across the north. Algiers already hinted at this. A capital facing the sea while the national map reaches inland and towards Saharan routes. Oran strengthens the clue, adding another Mediterranean face to a country outsiders often imagine mainly through desert depth, but also through music and streets. From the coast, roads climb into the populated north, then keep pulling the story toward plateaus and Sahara. So the sea is not the opposite of the desert in Algeria, it can be the entrance to it, for goods and imagination. Ports are machines of movement, but they are also emotional instruments. They measure what a country sends, receives and remembers long after ships disappear. A dock, a bus station, or the edge of a highway where people wait with bags and groceries can reveal more about a place than a monument ever could. In Jordan, movement often reads as arrival. People, pressure, diplomacy, refuge and opportunity collecting inside neighbourhoods, services, water and housing. That does not turn people into symbols, it simply shows how geography makes arrival visible in daily life. Algeria carries a different movement memory, one that often looks across the Mediterranean as much as across the Sahara, through language and family stories. Departure, study, labour, exile, return, these are not statistics here but human roots folded into place. The point is not that every Algerian story faces Europe, it is that the coast keeps that horizon present, even when life stays inland. This is where the Jordan-Algeria comparison stops being only about desert and starts becoming about access. One country makes access feel precious because the maritime doorway is narrow and the inland pressures are close. The other makes access feel layered because the coast is broad, but the interior remains immense across multiple cities and memories. Neither condition is better. Each creates a different instinct about movement, exposure, and how far systems must reach. In Jordan, the question often becomes, how do you absorb movement without losing balance? In Algeria, the question often becomes, how do you connect a vast interior without flattening its layers? The ports show what deserts alone hide. Access is also a form of pressure. If the sea is narrow, the country learns the value of openings. If it is broad, it learns the burden of connection. And now the comparison moves from routes to systems: water, distance, energy, roads, and the networks that make geography livable. Access and movement explain part of the story, but the future pressure is hidden in ordinary systems. What happens when water pressure in one place meets distance pressure in the other? The future comparison is hidden in ordinary objects: a rooftop tank, a pipeline, a road, a grid. One pressure is felt close to home, the other stretches across enormous distance. In Jordan, scarcity is not only an environmental condition, it becomes architecture, routine, and a quiet form of planning. Across Amman, rooftop tanks turn the skyline into a household water map, visible before policy is even explained. The point is not that every home experiences water the same way, it is that pressure becomes physically near. Pipes, cisterns, delivery rhythms, and storage habits make geography intimate, measured in apartments, stairwells, and family decisions. Jordan water scarcity is often discussed nationally, but in a compact country, national pressure can feel local very quickly. The city absorbs arrivals, grows over hills, and negotiates limited water inside a map already crowded with borders. This is desert adaptation at close range, not abstract survival, but management inside a tight urban and regional space. Now shift the frame west. In Algeria, the future pressure does not begin on one rooftop. It begins with distance. The Algerian Sahara is not simply beyond the country's main life. It is part of the country's territorial depth. To make that depth function, roads, grids, pipelines, and energy landscapes become a second kind of geography. A road across the interior is never just a road. It is a claim that distance can be connected. A pipeline is never only equipment. It is a line drawn through heat, terrain, maintenance, settlement, and national scale. This is why the water tank and the pipeline belong in the same comparison. One compresses pressure, the other extends it. Jordan's system asks how scarcity can be stored, rationed, moved, and trusted when space is tight. Algeria's system asks how resources, settlements, and services can remain connected when space opens almost beyond imagination. Neither question is simple. Heat, urban growth, food systems, and climate stress make both maps more demanding. But the stress arrives with a different shape. In Jordan, close and repeated. In Algeria, vast and infrastructural. The desert, again, is doing different work. In one place, it sharpens scarcity, in the other, it multiplies distance. Food security sits behind this too, because water, transport, energy, and land decide what daily stability can mean. Some future answers may involve new water projects, coastal utilities, renewable energy, and careful conservation, but the geography remains demanding. Look at Amman from above and the rooftops do not just show buildings, they show how a city anticipates interruption. Look across Algeria's interior and the lines crossing empty space do not show emptiness, they show the work of continuity. This is the chapter where culture gives way to systems, but the human layer does not disappear. Someone has to plan a tank, repair a pipe, schedule a delivery, maintain a road, monitor a station. Adaptation is not only national strategy, it is also 1,000 ordinary decisions that keep difficult geography livable. That is why this comparison cannot stop at identity, memory or coastline. The future tests the map directly. Jordan's compression means every pressure has less room to hide. Water, growth, borders, and arrivals overlap. Algeria's depth means every promise of connection must cross more landscape before it becomes everyday life. One country must make scarcity predictable at close range. The other must make distance governable across scale. And both must do it while the desert becomes hotter. Cities expand and expectations of ordinary life keep rising. Across Algeria, energy landscapes also reveal scale. Extraction, power, transmission, and settlement all have to negotiate distance. The future, then, is not a separate chapter from geography. It is geography asking for new forms of discipline. By now, the original label is broken apart. Arab, desert, regional sameness. None of it is enough. But the deeper pattern is finally ready to return. Both countries are adapting, just not to the same shape of pressure. In Jordan, adaptation often looks like conserving, storing, balancing and negotiating scarcity close to home. In Algeria, it often looks like connecting, maintaining, powering and remembering a state stretched across immense space. If these countries are not the same, what exactly is the one desert logic they share? By now, the original label is broken apart, but the deeper pattern is finally ready to return. The episode began with a resemblance. The answer is not that the resemblance was false, but that it was incomplete. The shared logic is not what they are called, it is what they have learned to solve, under different pressures. Jordan and Algeria share desert logic at a deeper level. Movement, scarcity, memory and scale, answered through different maps. In Jordan, the map compresses pressure. Borders, cities, routes and arrivals sit close enough to shape one another. Amman makes that compression visible. Hills crowded with homes, roads bending around slopes, rooftops carrying quiet evidence of water. Here, adaptation often becomes intimate, storage, timing, route choice, and the art of balancing pressures close to home. The desert is not distant mythology. It is a threshold near roads, neighbouring worlds and the habit of passage. That is why Jordan's logic feels like a hinge, compact in scale but reading many directions at once. Passages matter here because space is rarely neutral. A road can become a corridor, a border, or a lifeline. Compression is not a weakness in this story. It is the condition that gives Jordan its distinctive reflex. Algeria answers the same desert question from a different horizon. It begins at a sea-facing edge and keeps moving inward. Algiers looks Mediterranean, but the national map does not stop at the coast. It stretches through mountains and desert depth. The mountains complicate the story before the Sahara fully enters it. Identity is layered by terrain, language, memory, and distance. Gardea and other oasis worlds show that desert is not absence. It can be urban, organised, inherited, and deeply lived. Algeria's adaptation often becomes territorial. Roads, grids, pipelines, ports, and cities negotiate a scale that resists easy summary. Distance here is not blank space between places. It is one of the forces that gives the country its shape. Algiers facing the sea becomes the contradiction. Mediterranean in posture yet tied to an interior that changes everything behind it. So when Wadi Rum and the Sahara appear together, the match cut no longer says sameness, it asks function. One desert image points toward passage, the other opens into interior depth, where distance enters national imagination. This is the payoff hidden since the beginning. One desert logic, not one desert identity. The logic is adaptation, but adaptation does not erase difference. It reveals the pressure each place has learned to manage. History sharpened that difference. Jordan inherited a border world of mandates, routes, diplomacy and arrival. Algeria inherited rupture, resistance and coast-facing memory. Neither inheritance explains everything, but each left habits, how outside pressure is read, how territory is imagined, how memory enters public space. These afterlives are not museum pieces, they appear in streets, institutions, borders, boulevards, routes, and the emotional weight of place. The shared Arab and Islamic references matter, but they are not a single key that unlocks both countries. Jordan also carries Levantine, Bedouin, urban, Christian, Circassian, Palestinian, and other layers meeting inside compressed space. Algeria carries Arab, Amazigh, Maghrebi, Mediterranean, Saharan, oasis and mountain layers that cannot be reduced to coast or dunes. These layers are not decorations, they are ways people recognise home, family, language, music, food, worship and belonging. The label becomes useful only when it stays open enough to hold difference without forcing hierarchy. That is Arab world diversity at its most important, not a checklist of identities, but geography making belonging specific. A Jordan Algeria documentary only works when comparison becomes a lens, not a scoreboard between two national stories. A water tank above Amman and a pipeline crossing desert space are not symbols of deficiency. They are clues to different pressures. One system asks how scarcity is managed close to daily life. The other asks how distance is connected across a vast interior. Both are future questions, but neither belongs only to the future. They're already visible in ordinary landscapes. Roads, rooftops, ports, mountains, oases and city edges show geography becoming behaviour, not just background. Once geography becomes behaviour, the old label starts to feel too small, but not entirely wrong. It was unfinished. It named a connection before explaining the different problems that connection asks each country to solve. Jordan's answer is compression. Routes close together, borders close together, arrivals close together, water pressure close enough to appear on rooftops. Algeria's answer is depth. Sea, mountain, city, oasis and Sahara arranged across a scale that changes distance itself. The desert connects them, but not by making them alike. It connects them through desert adaptation in different languages. Comparison can clarify without ranking. It can show how two related images produce two different national instincts. The final image should not flatten them into one folder. It should let both maps remain alive at once. What else across the Arab world comes into focus once we stop treating the label itself as the explanation from one city street to the next?